The calendar shows the last day of the ending millennium, and Russian President Boris Yeltsin delivers his New Year's televised speech one day ahead. What he says will surprise 150 million Russians and the whole world. He will announce his resignation. His decision is said to be so sudden that even his own wife did not know about it until the last moment. Thus ends the remarkable story of a man who first became the symbol of Russia's fledgling democracy, and later the embodiment of corruption, theft, and a deep economic crisis. This was evident when he became the new head of state in 1991, and the majority of Russians received it with huge cheers. When he left office 8 years later, the reaction was equally tumultuous. Boris Yeltsin was born in 1931 and grew up in poverty in the village of Basmanovskoye in the Ural region. His parents were low-class workers. It soon becomes clear that young Boris wants more out of life. After primary and secondary school, he enrolled in the construction department of the Ural Polytechnic Institute and graduated in 1955. After leaving school, Yeltsin was assigned to work with the Lower ISET Construction Directorate in Sverdlovsk, today's Yekaterinburg. He quickly rose through the organization's ranks. Soon he becomes secretary of the entire Sverdlovsk region, and later he is noticed by the Moscow headquarters. In 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev invites him to the capital and helps him become first secretary of the Moscow City Party Committee. Yeltsin is unlike any of his predecessors. He does not take part in any big officialities, takes public transport, shops alone, does not attend parties. Instead, he visits businesses and building sites, but his political ambitions are no secret. In the autumn of 1987, at a plenary session of the Central Committee of the Communist Party, he criticizes the slow pace of reconstruction and insults Gorbachev. Since then, relations between the two have been very strained and Yeltsin is sidelined in the party structure. In 1989, however, his great comeback begins. He is elected to the newly formed Congress of People's Deputies, and then causes a stir during the 1990 Communist Congress by surrendering his party's legitimacy and resigning from the party. This decision is accompanied by shameful outcries of delegates. For ordinary people, however, these actions arouse admiration. Yeltsin's popularity is growing, so much so that a year later he is elected president of Russia. It is the most important republic of the entire Soviet Union, but still, it's just one of the 15 republics that made up the state. And it is led by Gorbachev. But by that time, the Soviet Union is beginning to crumble, and multiple republics want independence. In this situation, a group of leading party officials attempt a coup. President Gorbachev is placed under house arrest in Crimea, and a state of emergency is declared in the country. Yeltsin raced to the White House of Russia in Moscow to defy the coup, making a memorable speech from atop the turret of a tank onto which he had climbed. And in an ironic twist, demands the return of his enemy Gorbachev. Yeltsin was subsequently hailed by his supporters for rallying mass opposition to the coup. However, a culmination of events leads to the end of the Soviet Union. After its collapse, the Russian Federation takes over, and the first man in the state suddenly becomes its president, Boris Yeltsin. After that, he announces a large number of economic reforms. The term Yeltsinomics is used for the transition from a command economy into a capitalist market economy. But the result is a deep economic crisis. Inflation rises by hundreds of percent. People lose their savings. Businesses are going bankrupt and millions of people are out of work and money. In Soviet times, people stood in long queues outside half-empty shops. Now the goods are in stock, but there is no one to buy them. The Russians' frustration is increased by privatization. Amid the economic shift, a small number of oligarchs obtained a majority of the national property and wealth. Thus, international monopolies came to dominate the market, and large companies were privatized. The oligarchs became incredibly rich, and in exchange, they supported Yeltsin politically and financially. The country will become so poor that only state subsidies for basic food needs will prevent famine. This atmosphere will trigger the events that the whole world will watch in horror in the autumn of 1993. In September, the country will plunge into a constitutional crisis. The deputies want to address the situation in the country radically, and Yeltsin reacts by dissolving both houses of parliament by decree. The members of parliament counter by dismissing him as president. In the confusion, riots break out in Moscow and soon turn into bloody street fights. The defenders of the White House, as Parliament was then called, build barricades around it and arm themselves. Some of them later head toward the headquarters of the state television broadcast. The fights begin there. After Yeltsin's opponents shoot their way inside, they manage to stop the broadcast, which they say is spreading propaganda. The first deaths take place, and more come after the attack on Moscow City Hall. That's when Yeltsin makes his decision. With the help of the army, which he manages to win over to his side, he declares a state of emergency in the country. And then he orders the soldiers to attack the parliament building with tanks. The result is tragic. According to government figures, 187 people died, and 500 ended up in the hospital with serious injuries. Boris Yeltsin is now more powerful thanks to the newly elected parliament. Additionally, with the support of the oligarchs, he will defeat Gennady Zyuganov in the 1996 presidential elections. Since then, however, his popularity has rapidly declined. This is due to economic problems, as well as the disastrous war in Chechnya, which is seeking independence. During the 2 years of war, 100,000 people die. Yeltsin's critics also increasingly point out his fragile health and a number of his alcohol issues. For example, when he takes the conductor's baton in Berlin to celebrate the departure of Russian troops from Germany and decides to conduct a police orchestra. Then, in the summer of 1998, the country's economic problems culminate in an economic collapse, with Russia unable to pay its debts. Yeltsin's popularity is at a standstill, and events start to lead towards a downfall. In early August, Yeltsin dismisses the government of Prime Minister Stepashin, and a week later appoints Vladimir Putin, a former KGB agent in East Germany, as Prime Minister. Putin was also formerly a high-ranking official in St. Petersburg City Hall and the Kremlin, and the former head of Russian counterintelligence. Yeltsin would later say that it was Putin who he would like to see as his successor. And that takes us to the last week of 1999 when Boris Yeltsin delivers the traditional presidential speech. But he is unhappy with the quality of his voice, so he postpones filming until the 31st of December. But the text of the speech is different from the original one.
Я ухожу. Ухожу раньше положенного срока. Я понял, что мне необходимо это сделать. Россия должна войти в новое тысячелетие с новыми политиками, с новыми лицами, с новыми умными, сильными, энергичными людьми. А мы, те, кто стоит у власти уже многие годы, мы должны уйти.